La liberté sera quelque chose de vivant et de transparent. Et sa demeure sera pour toujours le cœur de l'homme.
In Lebanon, as you know, sectarianism is very old. It has started with the French Mandate, where the French colonial powers basically tried to manage the Lebanese created entity in 1920 to allocate seats in parliament, but also all sorts of public positions according to sex. And it was really the French colonial system that started the whole sectarianism this way. Then this was further very much present in the National Pact at independence of Lebanon in 1943. And just to give you a couple of numbers, in the 1932 census, we only have one official census in Lebanon that was conducted in 1932. Nothing was done afterwards officially. In that census, the share of the Maronite population was 28%. The Sunni population was 22%, and the Shiite was 19%. And back then, in the National Pact, the presidency was given to the Maronites, the prime minister to the Sunnis, and the speaker of parliament to the Shiite, following the largest sects that are composing the country. Also, the Constitution of 1943 of independence created a system where you need to have the main positions at the top of government and directors in terms of parity between Christians and Muslims, and to respect the allocation and to respect the sectarian distribution. And in parliament back then, there was a 6-to-5 ratio between Christians and Muslims in 1940. The Civil War, which lasted from 1975 to 1990, made a huge demographic shift in the country. And there were many papers that studied the implications of the Civil War on the sectarian composition, but the main result was that there were a decrease in the number of the Christian sects and an increase in the Muslim population, for many reasons that we can discuss if you want in the questions and answers, but this made that the Taif Accord in 1989 specifically said that we will decrease the power of the Maronite president and increase the powers of the Council of Ministers, and to have more significance in the powers of the Muslim group, one that is between the Speaker of Parliament and the Council of Ministers. And in parliamentary representation and the seats, the ratio was shifted from 6-to-5 to 1-to-1. And actually, in the current distributions, if you look at, and we'll see some numbers of the confessional distribution of the voters, the number of the Muslim voters registered is larger than the Christian voters. So the 1-to-1 ratio is even no longer valid in terms of the confessional distribution. So let's look at the parliamentary composition. This is just a timeline that shows that in 1992, after the war, there were 128 MPs and 12 districts. There were some changes and increases. Specifically in 2009, the districts increased to 26 with the same number of MPs. And in the latest elections, we had 15 districts and same number of MPs. In 92, the composition was set by 32 seats for the Maronites, 14 for Greek Orthodox, and so on and so forth. But in 1992, there was a boycott of elections by most of the Christian, or the so-called Christian opposition, and it lasted for a long time back then. And under the Syrian control over Lebanon, the Syrian regime presence, there was the parliamentary representation was put into question. In 2000, again, you had a distribution that was beginning to be slightly, shifting towards more of the Muslim seats, but still maintaining the same number of MPs. And in 2005, you had the distribution of parliament was more around political blocks that were around March 14 and March 8. But even within these blocks, the allocation of seats was more or less consistent for Muslim seats, but the Christian seats were more represented within the March 14 bloc. And then in 2009 elections, you had slight changes, but still confessional distribution. And then back then, the distribution of MPs was, as you can see here. Now, what happened in 2008? Basically, 2008, we had, for the first time, proportional representation was introduced, but the allocation of seats in parliament still followed sectarian distribution. So you had to vote on sectarian seats, but with proportional representation, with proportional thresholds. Now, they introduced, the ruling class, a trick in this law that because you have to cast a preferential vote within the list, and the preferential vote was limited to the district, not the governorate, to the qada, not to the muhafaza level, the lower level. It basically replicated the results of the previous elections. So even if you had lists competing with thresholds, the fact that you choose one MP as a preferential vote in your small district, so in the 25 districts that were available, this means that by default you are voting on a sectarian basis again. So the proportional law that was introduced in 2018 did not really move towards proportional representation in politics. It basically replicated the sectarian allocation of seats in parliament. Now, just to give you some recent numbers on the confessional distribution, this is according to the latest voter registry in 2018. The total number of Muslim registered voters was 2.4 million compared to 1.3 million Christian voters allocated. Here you have the Sunni and Shia, almost 1 million, very close, largest communities, followed by the Maronites, 746,000, and then you can go down. So one fundamental issue in sectarian allocation in Lebanon is that it doesn't follow anymore the sectarian distribution. So if we are really a sectarian country, we probably would need to change the distribution to reflect more of the Muslim population. And I'm not saying this out of partisanship, I'm just saying from a purely scientific perspective, this so-called sectarian system, the way it is applied, does not reflect the distribution of the population as it is now in the current voter registry. Now, of course, we can debate this and argue about this, but on the face of it, the sectarian system is not serving the purpose it was set to do. It's still maintaining a one-to-one balance on allocation of seats. And obviously, this law in 2018 created a lot of lists, but the same parties ran against each other and with each other according to each district and region. They had alliances with, that were very hybrid. And this is an illustration taken from an LCPS study. You can see the Free Patriotic Movement had a plethora of alliances with almost everybody, and followed by the others, and it was really not very consistent, even along sectarian lines. So the real politics that were played was more of alliances to maintain their grip on power. We'll come back to the results of it, but this is from Parliament. Now let's look at the government. So the first result you can see here is that it is entrenched in the first level of representation that the Lebanese have to vote on sectarian basis, but even the sectarian allocation has its own problems, has even more recent problems in terms of representation and in terms of how easy it is to manipulate these alliances and make sure that you have a cartel that still gets a grip on power. Now let's look at the government perspective. Why is it so hard to form a government? And you will see in a bit how much time it took to form many governments. Well, these are some numbers we've compiled for the course. Salim Hus's government in 1989 took 13 days to be formed and had only 14 ministers. This is at the end of the civil war. And then you had various governments. What you can immediately see is we probably had a new government every year since the end of the civil war. We compete with, I think, Jordan in the turnover of governments, but Jordan has more ministers that were selected. The probability to be a minister in Jordan, I don't know if there's a Jordanian here, but it's almost 1. Everybody can be a minister. In Lebanon, every government is formed very frequently, but nobody can be a minister unless they're connected in a way. But what you can see here is recently, this is towards this side, you can find that after 2010, governments took up to 315 days to be formed, 165 days. The recent episode we had with the most recent Saad Hariri government is not unique. We Lebanese tend to have a short memory. And if you look back over the past 30 years, well, the most recent 10 years were very problematic in terms of government formation. And obviously also adding more ministers. We probably can work with only 14 or 15 ministers, but we have to have 30 ministers. The recent government, there were talks that they wanted to add 32. Obviously because of political infighting, but also because we didn't have people in the first place. They were not there to do it, physically not there to do it, and not allowed by law as a caretaker government to enact anything. Now, to add to this beautiful picture and non-depressing, we also had, just to remind everybody, that we had almost on a yearly basis since 2010 here, but we can go even back. Every summer or winter, or we had clashes, problems in big cities, we had attacks, we had resignations, we had political deadlock. This is just a very simple timeline, and there's more to it. And this is also political instability, how one president resigns, one other stays at home, another council of minister president gets kidnapped somewhere outside of the country. You know, we have a lot of things that happen that we easily forget, unfortunately. So all of this also meant, on top of the distribution, a lot of issues. Now, just to give you the implications of sectarianism first on the size of the cabinet, obviously, the largest size of cabinet, which is 30 ministers, was enacted 11 times. And we only had 2 times where we had only 14 ministers. And the government worked back then. So we could, in principle, have only 14 ministers. Because many of them are ministers of state with no actual budgets or not even any residence. And the more worrying practice, which is not in the constitution, but it has become a practice, is that ministries are allocated according to how, and they use the term, juicy they are. In Arabic they would say Wuzarat al-Dasima. They use the term, Dasima. Dasima in Arabic means fat or juicy, or something you can eat very well. What are the juicy ministries? The best ministry, quote unquote, is the Ministry of Defense, because it has the largest budget the army budget, and it oversees security in the country. Ministry of Defense has historically been held by the Greek Orthodox. So, because this is a practice, you suddenly now have in the allocation, in the algorithm that the government has to make up, not only allocate the government seats based on parties, but also allocate them based on sects that are entitlements to certain ministries. So Ministry of Defense goes to a Greek Orthodox, and then we see if it goes to a Free Patriotic Movement or to another movement, we see who it goes to, but it has to go to a Greek Orthodox. Ministry of Interior was held for a long time by a Sunni, so it has to go to a Sunni. Also a very important ministry. Ministry of Finance, extremely important ministry, was held by Maronites for a long time, but then more recently it went to Shia, so now it has to stay with the Shia. This is how actually, they're not published, unfortunately, they have to be published, but the discussions around government formation go into these details. We allocate the ministries and the sects, and then we see whose party they would go to. This is just an illustration. Education has to go to a Muslim, maybe a Sunni, now it goes to a Druze. Foreign affairs, Maronite, maybe always Gibran Wasid, I don't know. But it has to go to a Maronite, and then it's allocated based on that practice. So you have more illustrations here. Energy to a majority Christian. Telecom was more for Christians recently with Sunnis. Public transport was with the Muslims, and then shifted to Maronites. But whatever ministry would shift, you would make sure that you get an equally juicy ministry in exchange for that. And a lot of political leaders were documented in the media by saying, okay, you give me transport, I give you energy, or and it was like a bazaar, bargaining bazaar. In the most recent, so the current government, this is also a nice illustration that shows how, done by Ben Red for Daily Star, how the cabinet formation along parties was reflected in, reflects the parliament one. The outer one is the parliament, the inner one is the party distribution within the government. The reason the current government took so much time to be formed is that the parts of the government, mainly the Free Patriotic Movement, were arguing that not only we need sectarian allocation, but we want to reflect the results of elections. And we want to truly reflect how the parties control parliament in the government. So they added a layer of sophistication in the algorithm that took a long time to be resolved. Eventually it got resolved by adding yet more or maintaining state ministers and trying to allocate the juicy ministries between. And Ben Red also had another very nice, you can find them all on online or in Daily Star. He had a nice illustration on how the ministries shifted from the parties to others within between 2016 and 2019. You can see some shifts, but as I mentioned, all of these shifts will happen according to equal parameters. I will not give you my share unless you give me an equally important share. And this was a standard practice. Now moving on to a very important issue is that, okay, we have a sectarian practice, but are citizens really aligned with this practice, or are Lebanese citizens questioning this? Well, I hate to tell you that we, at least in Beirut, live in a huge bubble. Most Lebanese citizens, not today, but since maybe at least the last 30 years, are first, and this is according to a study done by Theodor Hanf in the same methodology and sampling, in 87, 2006, and he was asking opinion surveys and some questions, and he would say, well, do you prefer neighbors who are on the same background as you? In 87, 40% of the Lebanese agreed with this statement, and 36% still agree with it. No, sorry, 55% agreed. Now it's 59 in 2006. And in general, most Lebanese, and this is with opinion surveys, are very religious, trust only their community, and are very trustworthy of their political leader, unfortunately. Now, recent data by the LCPS confirmed a very dangerous trend that unfortunately we have seen within the preferential vote system. The preferential vote system that I mentioned to you about. So technically this preferential vote has to go to a single candidate within a particular district. 78% of the votes casted preferentially went to a candidate from the same confession. And this is horrific. And I mean, the idea of proportional system was to have an opening up of the electoral system. It actually maintained and cemented the sectarian relation between the voter and the leaders. Now, we can probably debate if this is a chicken and egg situation, that because we have this law, people voted this way, but fundamentally, on average, most Lebanese are still very sectarian and still very much entrenched within their communities, unfortunately. Now, moving on to the impacts of sectarianism. Why is it so bad? Sectarianism has major issues linked to inequality. It is a very inefficient system because it duplicates and it allocates schools and hospitals and roads and all sorts of investments on what we call in Lebanese which is the parity between religions. And this is an example from a paper we did back in 2010, but on, for instance, measuring the need for beds in some areas and how many hospitals were created. And you would imagine any country that has a sound public policy system, you would channel the investments, the hospitals, education investment to the most needy. In Lebanon, they are not channeled to the most needy, and if they go to the most needy, you have to provide for other areas to make sure all areas and sects get the same allocation. So, if you have money and a grant to have a hospital in Akkar is the poorest region in Lebanon. Because Akkar is majority Muslim Sunni, you need a hospital in the south, in the Shia place, you need a hospital in the Maronite, you need a hospital in the Greek Orthodox. If you don't do 5 hospitals, the one hospital in Akkar will not pass. And I'm responsible for what I'm saying. These are people inside institutions, the Council of Development and Reconstruction, Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Finance, that have confirmed that they have asked personally donors and countries that, wait, this will not pass the Council of Ministers unless you have a provision for more schools, more hospitals, more roads, more power plants, more everything. So technically, we ended up with empty schools where we don't need them, and lack of schools, public schools, where we are needing them the most. So it's backfiring. As a system, it has backfired on the population. In a period of 10 years, exactly the sectarian distribution. The share of Druze got 6%, they got 6% of the money, Shias got 27%, Sunni 30%, and the rest got each one according to their share. What is fascinating in a cynical way is that this sectarian cartel system managed to allocate funds among each other to the penny, to the Lebanese lira. They have managed to, distribute them in at least between sects in an efficient way. What does this mean? In practice, it meant that we had ballooning public debt, because obviously not all hospitals were given to us for free, not all hospitals were given to us as grants. Most of the money that we got, the estimate is $12 billion as soft loans, 12 billion. All of this money was given as loans, so we have paid, well, we are still paying for it as debt. Sectarianism is costing Lebanon more debt because you have to technically please everybody, and obviously nobody's that pleased in the end. So it's not working anymore. Now, Melanie Kamet, also a friend and colleague, and she's now based in Harvard. She worked a lot on, outside of the government, how also political parties allocated their services to regions. And she worked specifically on Hezbollah social services and future movement social services. And she basically tried to answer a basic question. Do these parties also internally serve their own constituents, or they try to go outside of their constituents? I mean, anecdotally, we know the answer, but it was nice to see some data and some confirmation. And so this is a map that shows distribution of the welfare agencies of the future movement against the concentration of the Sunni population. And you can see immediately that wherever there were more Sunnis, the future movement tended to open more social centers to take care of their population. And this is for the Hezbollah distribution of social services. And again, it matched very well the largest proportion of Shia on the district level. So following very closely this model of caring for your own community and trying to maintain these patronage networks. What about the social impacts of sectarianism? One of the key issues of sectarianism, and that is felt on a daily basis, is the lack of a personal status law that is a civil law, and the discrimination between citizens and between genders, specifically against women. And if you have a spectrum of who are the worst category in the Lebanese confessional system from a personal status law, you would find that Sunni women are the most discriminated against. And then followed by a spectrum, of course everybody is discriminated against, more women than men, definitely. But Sunni women are the worst category. They cannot inherit the husband from a different religion. If they want to file for divorce, it has to be it's very complicated. They don't get custody very quickly. If the husband dies, the inheritance is split among her and his brothers and family and male children, and she gets maybe a fourth of every male. It's very complicated. That's why actually a lot of Sunni, even politicians like Salim al-Husn and others, Salim al-Husn has only had one daughter. He converted into Shia to make sure that he passes on his inheritance to her. Imagine a Sunni prime minister converting to Shia. Khalil would not do it. Hostile. Anyways, so this, the first social cost is really the impact on people. I mean, people feel this on an everyday basis. The second big problem is, I tried to do like a back of the envelope calculation by trying to see the cost of sectarianism in schools, because schools have an obligatory religious education program that is tailored per confessional school. So schools get 1 hour a week of religious lessons, but they're not the same religious lessons across the country. So Sunni schools, and we're talking not only private institutions, also public schools that fall within religious areas follow the religious education of that area. This is even the more dangerous part. Some parts of Beirut that fall within a Sunni community, they took Friday off as a day of vacation instead of the Saturday, Sunday thing, against the current school practice. again, I'm not judging this if this is good or bad, but just to show you that there is an inherent discrimination in the educational system that basically costs money even in schools, because not only you need to pay for this education, but technically, in my opinion, this education doesn't have a value added later on in the job market or any other market. I'm not a religious person, so please respect my opinion, but in any case, there is discrimination at every level that is costing the Lebanese society welfare, that is costing them even on their mental health and also on their pocket from every level. I give you another example. Who here from the Lebanese wants to do their official papers and they're not registered in Beirut? They live in Beirut, they're registered outside of Beirut. Raise your hand. Who's registered outside of Beirut? How much money do you pay to get your papers from your village?
We go there.
You go there, if you don't go there, you have to pay like 50,000 every time. You have to get a time off to go to your village. The traffic, we're all registered in our villages. The estimate is that residents of Beirut, about 40% are in their villages, registered still in their villages. So this is costing society because people still want to, get registry based on sectarian basis. Finally, before we open for, I think, heated discussion, hopefully, is there a way out? Well, I will not be pretentious and tell you yes. I will just tell you what is out there, what are ideas that were speculated, and many obviously didn't work. But one idea was to achieve more, reduce inequality between individuals and achieve stability, and this automatically will erase the need for a sectarian system. This is really from, if you read reports by the UN in Lebanon, this is the approach I want to do. The argument there is that sectarianism is here because people are afraid of each other. As a Maronite, I am a minority. I'm afraid that if a non-Maronite governs Lebanon, they will not take care of my needs. So maybe if there is not so much economic and social difference in the country and there is more peace, then there is no need for this sense of protection. This is what at least what is published from the UN system, what they're working towards. They will put first reducing inequality, achieving more peace, and then maybe this will lead to a self or an automatic erosion of the need for sectarianism. Now, others have put forward the need to have a new social contract altogether. And this is more the movement that was born long before the 2011, but in 2011 there was a massive protest for Isqat al-Nizam al-Ta'ifi, so basically putting down the sectarian system as a whole, and it had a big variety of actors and stakeholders. The main idea behind it is that you cannot really wait for the system to be reformed. You cannot treat the symptoms or the consequences. You have to treat the root cause, which is a dysfunctional social contract. We're not applying sectarianism like Switzerland, like a canton basis, or like Belgium on a linguistic basis. We don't have pure positive discrimination like in the US, that is in the law. We have discrimination that is imposed without any demographic backup. So this is creating a huge problem. Hassan Nasrallah was many times in the media saying that we accept to have a reform in the constitution as long as the president is elected directly from the population. So why would he accept that? Because given that the Shia demographic now is probably one of the largest single demographic, and given that it has a lot of cohesion towards its political representation, there is a feeling that yes, you can move away from sectarianism for groups that can easily control the outcome. obviously the Maronites are against abolishing the current constitution and want to maintain that the president is elected by the parliament with a very one-to-one parity. The Prime Minister of Lebanon, the current Prime Minister, Saad Hariri, was quoted time and time again saying, our reason of existence in this country, our politics, is to maintain one-to-one parity. Everywhere, in the municipality, in the parliament, in the government, everywhere. And this was used again by the Free Patriotic Movement and Jabran Basir and others by saying, we have to maintain parity in the first level positions in government. So in Lebanese government positions, we have 5 levels. The first level is under the minister, very important, Director General of a certain ministry. Second level is a powerful employee. Third is less, like teachers, and fourth is really the bottom. Fifth is really like a very, very minimal grade. In the constitution, it says we maintain confessional distribution up to the first level, and we wait for abolishing it in certain times. This is in the current Thai constitution. But Jabran Basir and others, we have more and more with social media, perception bias network, what we call in social sciences, network perception bias. We tend to think that what we observe and interact with is the trend. But statistically, the averages, the majorities are somewhere else. The same thing applies, and I agree with you, to the interaction, the coexistence on a class level. This is only observed statistically and with data in the rich class. So only the top 10% who go to the private universities, who can come and have a drink. I mean, here we don't have marks on who's Muslim, who's Christian. We all look human. So, but once you go to poorer places, then the markers are very clear, the veils or the signs, and this is 90% of the population. So 10% are interacting. Before the Civil War, it used to be a larger number. My parents, who are from different sects, met in Lebanese University. It was a huge melting pot of, and it was very cheap, accessible to all the middle class and poor background. Now the Lebanese University is more for, per region and attracts the poorer class, and only the rich, unfortunately, tend to experience coexistence with others. And that's very problematic. In terms of the suggestion, so I think so. A practical way out and an easy, quote unquote, is women's rights, because instead of fighting for non-discrimination on sectarian basis, which is very tough, at least try to win the battles through women's rights, because there are women from different religions that are impacted, and they are, in a way, much more discriminated against. And we're seeing signs of hope that this might pass, even though if you follow the recent debate on the nationality for women married to foreigners, many religious leaders are completely opposed against it. But at least the politicians, they're open to it, much more than before. So this is hopeful, definitely. Now, for one district, Lebanon, pure proportional in this sectarian system doesn't work. You will get the same result. Because there are talks right now that the first thing on the agenda of the government is to think about a new electoral law, because it's very funny. I mean, I heard this from an MPs. They were not happy with this preferential vote. They didn't understand how it worked, and many of them took the hit. So they want to take away the preferential vote. I don't know how they will do it with the proportionality. Maybe they will cancel proportionality altogether. I'm not very optimistic that we need to keep on fighting for it. I'll stop here for now, and then we'll come back.
قبل ما يتم يعني قبل ما يكون عندنا برلمان معمل له بث على اساس طائفي، هل برايك ممكن انشاء مجلس شيوخ قبل ما نعمل هذا الستيب يكون بطريقه واي اوت مثل ما كنا عم عم بحكي ولا ممكن انه يصير هيك قبل ما عن جد يتم تطبيق الدستور وتم كتب الماده اللي خاصه بمجلس الشيوخ؟ يعني هل مجلس الشيوخ فينا نستعمل بطريقه غير فقط ولا حتى يتم الغاء التأثير السياسي؟
So your presentation, looking at sectarianism in Lebanon, which implies also corruption, right? Nice level. Are there other forms of sectarianism where we don't have a corrupt system, so don't back sectarianism, but you just have people or sect leaders who are good or whatever, who are not corrupt, as in are looking after the good of their people? That's just my first question. And then, so if sectarianism is a division of the population into different ideologies and beliefs, isn't the best solution to create public spaces and have all sects interact together so that we can know for a fact that there are a lot of religious people, for example, or we can meet our wives there, like you did, or so just public spaces and making people less afraid of each other, right? Less afraid of their beliefs and understanding that those are very superficial seems like a good option.
Thank you very much for this presentation. It inspired a lot of questions and thoughts. One thing I'm quite curious about is, and you touched on a little bit, about the juicy ministry positions, right? How does that play out on the ground in terms of exacerbating problems like the garbage, solid waste, electricity? What does that mean in terms of sort of an inability to fix very entrenched problems going on in Lebanon? And where is the breaking point in terms of how much is the public may accept this any longer in terms of living on generator power or not being able to drink the water? Secondly, what does this all mean in terms of the Paris conference money and the $11 billion that Lebanon's supposed to bring in foreign finance? I think the World Bank representative was here last week sort of saying this is going to be a problem, but is that going to be conditional that the government sort of needs to straighten out a bit to actually harness the $11 billion in investment?
Thank you also for that presentation. It's really informational. I'm curious more about religion or Islam and Christianity. I know you said that people tend to, they're divided in certain areas, but also they come together in other areas. Is there a trend for, Sunnis and Shia to come together and different sects within Christianity to come together, or is it very random? Also, I'm really curious about this idea of kind of extrapolating the idea of progress for women, aside from the fact that it doesn't connect to the religion itself. To me, it seems like it is connected to religious identity. So how are you not going to make people feel left out if you're saying, oh, this is the way women should be treated, and how is that not going to exclude people?
When we talk about voting behavior, when we talk about the civil war, sometimes it feels like Melanie Kamet's study talked about how 78% of people are voting according to sectarian belief, but it kind of feels like sometimes we're dismissing other aspects. It feels like we're always talking about the sectarian dimension as if it's a classless society.
أنا عندي اعتراض على نقطة ما بوافق عليها أبداً، اللي هو بالنسبة إذا عملنا قانون انتخاب بلبنان لوحدة النسبية. فينا نتحدث بالموضوع إنه في ناس عندها محاذير على غير شيء، بس عددياً إذا بدنا نحسب كل ما نكبر الدائرة كل ما ممكن نواب من برا الطبقة السياسية يوصلوا. هلا انا عملت سيميوليشنز على الموضوع، مش انه هيك حكي. اذا طبقنا الداتا فينا نعمل دوائر اكبر من اللي موجودين، وفينا نعمل داتا وحده لبنان. ممكن الحركه الاعتراضيه نسميها او بين نيلين، ممكن نجيب بين 2 3 4 أو 5 نواب من برات هذه الطبقه. هلا اذا اعتبرنا انه بدنا تغيير جذري، ما فينا نعمل تغيير جذري، بس بالنسبه لي 4 5 نواب من برات الطبقه هو شيء كثير عظيم. بس لنقدر نعمل هذا الشيء كمان في نقطه كثير مهمه، ما قصه بس الدوائر، هي قصه العتبه، يعني الثريشولد. هلا نحن عندنا ثريشولد بين 28% حسب الدائره، اللي هو ثريشولد مش طبيعي، ولا بلد بالعالم في شيء اصلا فوق 7 8%، ما في، عاده بين 0 و 7%. نحن اذا وقعنا الثريشولد على الصفر، عملنا يعني بيقولوا البروجرام ريس، بلا فينا، يعني هذه الاشياء في واحد يعدلها بالقانون، يعني ما انا شايف انه فينا نعمل تعديل بالقانون جذري نرجع نقلبه غير شيء. يمكن دوائر بدل 15 دائره، اذا عملنا 6 دوائر وبلا ثريشولد، هذا يمكن يكون افضل ممكن.
A lot of people are saying that the only way to prior to the 1975 war, people used to say that the war would be the way to break the sectarian system. And we're going to go for war for a couple of years and then abolish this sectarian system. Do you think now, with the expected financial crisis and monetary crisis, that such a crisis would make people wake up and vote in a different way, or big players are gonna prevent that from happening? And I have a question about the electoral system, which you think is the best for the situation to break this sectarian problem, which I agree with you on. Another example about how sectarianism is affecting the Lebanese residents is the real estate prices. Now, with some municipalities preventing, let's say Christian municipalities preventing Muslims from buying an apartment in their districts, this is creating a market inequilibrium, disparity. If you're a Muslim trying to get a nice apartment in a good neighborhood, you're going to have to pay around 25% more per square meter than the price of a equal neighborhood in a Christian community. I think this is similar to the employment thing you were talking about. One more thing, every time we get near to changing the system, we come and change the rules. This prevents people like you from working on attacking the system from within. Because every time they change the rule. And is it normal to have such drastic changes in the electoral system every election? Like, I haven't seen 2 consecutive elections with the same rule, except maybe during the Syrian occupation time.
Some people say that since the sectarian system is very much linked to also financial resources and services that are provided by those sectarian political parties to their electoral basis. So since those services are actually, and those funding sources are decreasing and becoming more and more limited because the countries that are providing this funding are losing funding, or those parties are losing this funding, they say that it's an opportunity actually for new movements to come in, and because we feel that people are more and more angry towards those political parties that are not providing them those services anymore, or that are not reaching them anymore, because they used to be able to reach a wider range of people with this funding and those services, and now they are not anymore. What do you think about that?
I will start by answering the question on the solutions. So one of them is Mazishu, or the Council for the sectarian allocation, or the Senate, like an appointed Senate that would be elected really for sectarian leaders. This is definitely one solution in the Constitution. There's another solution that says that we need to get away gradually from the sectarian allocation and go towards a civil state. This is in the Constitution itself. These are all very valid and important points. Even what you mentioned about, and somebody else mentioned about electoral reform. having larger districts, lower thresholds in proportional representation, and others. These are a checklist of everything that should happen and that can happen. The major problem is, who will do it? Who will do it? The current parliament, by law, is the parliament that can decide on legal reform. This parliament decides on electoral law. The parliament decides on the Senate Council. The parliament decides on everything, and the parliament is a sectarian parliament, is a conventional, is a cartel. So we have to be pragmatic in a way. It's not to say that we cannot do anything, but maybe to think that we need to have loopholes and we need to try to dig a bit deeper in the system. But I'm not really optimistic that we can propose something that the majority of those who are not agreeing with us don't want to implement anyways. I think we need to be, I would say, and I'm also opposed to this political class. We collectively as citizens that are enlightened in a way, we need to think about more workable solutions, because the big solutions, nobody is organized enough to implement them, unfortunately, not yet. So again, your idea about public space. Major decisions that happened in Lebanon that were, in the positive sense, more increased coexistence, reduced class inequities, and sectarian inequities, were implemented when you had very strong government. And the strong government, unfortunately, was a military government. The Shahab era was a military government. The sectarian parties took a backseat, and the military government was allowed to be operating under the regional, and again, somebody else here mentioned the regional dimension, it's very important. There was a regional umbrella between Syria and Egypt back then, with Nasser, that gave Shahab the upper hand militarily to imitate Nasser. And he was given a period, kind of a watching and grace period by the sectarian leaders, but they ended up removing it very violently and destroying his but fortunately, most of the things he created back then and his advisors, national and social security, Lebanese University, labor law, public schooling, all of these systems were created back then. Until now, we don't have any other social projects that were implemented, grand scheme social projects, because those in power want to implement the opposite. And the minority, I would still insist that those who want to abolish sectarianism and have more equality, unfortunately, are still a minority, at least a political minority. This will not happen overnight. We need to be more pragmatic. Nobody objected. When they disagreed, the waste crisis was in front of them. Then they agreed back again to have 2 landfills, and things continue. So it's not a matter of ministries breaking down, it's about the cartel breaking down. It's the agreement between them to how to split the pie and how to split the revenue. Because waste, electricity, fuel, banks, everything is divided among these leaders. They have companies, they have friends, countries in the region might have a dictator, we have 8.
La liberté sera quelque chose de vivant et de transparent. Et sa demeure sera pour toujours le cœur de l'homme. À partir de maintenant,